Hello there everyone, and welcome back to another video on the Mars Base project. As I mentioned at the end of the last video, I was planning to visit an exhibition called Moving to Mars, currently hosted in the Design Museum here in London. You've probably already noticed that this will be a slightly longer video, but I invite you to bear with me and join me on my way through the exhibition, exploring these incredible ideas and concepts in an attempt to draw inspiration for the Mars Base project and ultimately come up with a much more detailed game design document. It really is a fantastic exhibition, and I can only recommend a visit for anyone who happens to be around London and is only vaguely interested in Mars exploration or colonisation. September 1877. The orbits of Earth and Mars brought the two planets particularly close. Called an opposition, this allowed astronomers to see Mars better. At the observatory in Milan, Giovanni Schiaparelli identified exciting new features, seas, continents, and even channels, which he called canali. Most other astronomers were unable to confirm what Schiaparelli saw through his telescope, but his drawings, the earthly names he chose, and above all, the fascinating idea of the canals, made his observations believable. What really struck me about this is that almost 150 years ago, they already had such a detailed idea of what Mars might look like. Not only were people letting their creativity fly free in an attempt to imagine what otherworldly things could possibly be waiting out there, but actively engaging in the enormous undertaking of scientific research with the prospect of maybe, sometime in the future, someone making use of that very research to bring us one step closer on humanity's journey to space. And now, more than 100 years after Schiaparelli's death, we are still taking pictures, analysing the Martian surface, soil, atmosphere, weather, all with the goal of finally sending humans to Mars. And just like 100 years ago, we are displaying the best humanity has to offer to design homes and workplaces in an effort to build a Martian colony, our new home 200 million kilometers away from the Earth. There exists a wide range of concepts of how a future colony on Mars might look like, a number of which are displayed in a miniature form which I find absolutely incredible to look at. I can only imagine this turning into reality within our lifetimes. In terms of game design, they are equally as interesting, as all of them seem to share a common theme, a division into interior and exterior structures. The exterior's function is to serve as a layer of protection from radiation and other environmental influences like sandstorms or meteorites. The implementation varies between different concepts, reaching from a form of artificially built cave to a sort of dome spanning the structures below it. The building material used is pretty much universal though. It's a special concrete produced from the Martian soil itself. The soil is then molten and 3D printed by a set of special robots. There are 3 types of robot builders, each specialized for one of the 3 jobs: dig, move, and melt. The process gets greater reliability from using simple single-task machines rather than one type of multifunctional smart robot builder. The digger robots piled up the loose regolith for the mover robots to pile on top of the inflatable modules. Then, once a layer of regolith is in place, the melter robots fuse patches of the regolith into crystalline state, gradually stitching the developing domes together. The aim of the 3-part robot construction process is to cover each inflatable living module with a thick layer of stabilized regolith. This is needed to reinforce the pressurized modules, but also to block radiation and retain heat. I like this idea, and I think it could translate into some interesting gameplay mechanics as well. Having more than one type of robot to accomplish a certain task means that different components or level of expertise might be required to build them. It also divides the process of gathering a resource into somewhat of a production chain. Having 3 unique robots does seem slightly convoluted though, so it might make sense to just use 2 types, the digger and melter. Growing plants on Mars will be done in various ways. Some will be grown in greenhouses, some in lab-style tanks, some using hydroponics. Scientists talk of closed-loop ecosystems that can sustain life in a space station or on Mars indefinitely. That means ideally that human waste and carbon dioxide from exhaled air can be recycled using an appropriate mix of plants and living organisms to regenerate oxygen and create food. The problem with spacebound systems is that the automatic stability of plant life on Earth is hard to replicate. Plants can sicken and unforeseen contaminations can accumulate. The systems need extreme vigilance and sophisticated monitoring. Complex closed-loop systems would be required to sustain life on Mars. They ensure that essential resources, particularly water and oxygen, are recycled. Equally importantly, they need to convert waste back to food. So, the ultimate aim is to make the machines that convert waste into viable resources, vital, lived-in elements of the habitat. The architect Lydia Caliponi proposes new pairing linkings, for example, a toilet and a garden, a bioreactor and a bathroom, or a kitchen and a laboratory. In the end, a Martian colony can almost be viewed as a life form in itself, a complex integrated system where humans and their innate physiology of ingestion and excretion become biological parts of the whole system that they inhabit. Now, I find this idea particularly interesting as it results in gameplay mechanics that would force the player to rethink and approach somewhat traditional concepts in a novel way. Of course, the challenge from a game design perspective will be to implement an incentive to build like this without forcing the player to do so. I believe that one good way of achieving this is to implement a system of environmental factors like heat, noise or pollution. These systems may turn out to be quite challenging to implement though, especially when it comes to giving straightforward visual feedback to the player. The other, arguably much simpler way is to have one structure produce an item that is needed by another. Since these items will have to be moved around, there is a clear advantage in providing short walking distances and hence build the structures closer together. What I want to avoid doing is to add some sort of bonus radius around a structure, like say a plant will grow 20% faster if a toilet is built in a radius of 10 tiles next to it. I feel that this should really be the last resort in trying to incentivize the player to play the game in the quote-unquote right way. So this spiked 2 ideas. One is to focus on the closed-loop systems by, for example, collecting waste from loos and using it to produce fertilizers. The second is to introduce an oxygen system that includes carbon dioxide. The idea is to ideally balance the two by using plants only. The oxygen production can be supported by oxygen generators, which may require a lot of energy to incentivize the player without punishing him too much. Lastly, for players that enjoy a bit more of a challenge, disasters such as diseases or crop failures could be introduced. Another thing that can sometimes help provoke good ideas is to look at other games and see what sort of problems they have and how one could improve upon them or simply do things differently. One of those games that I've mentioned before on this channel is developed by a studio called Madruga Works and goes by the name of Planet Base. First of all, let me say that I love this game. It's a fantastic city builder through and through and deserves credit at a lot of places. However, there are still a few things that I've stumbled across. Firstly, the inhabitants really seem to hate sticking to the same bed. That might not necessarily be a huge problem, but it breaks the immersion a bit when the same person works on a different profession every day. Something that I found more annoying though is how the game prevents you from placing structures freely, even if there is clearly enough space at times. This also applies to things like placing structures inside buildings, like say a table within a kitchen. Here I think a grid-based building system, although being seemingly more restrictive, might actually be beneficial in giving the player more precise control over where to build things. Planet Base takes the approach of people having infinite lives, unless they starve to death or get killed in an invasion, of course. Hence, the only way for the colony to grow is to attract new colonists to join the base. Personally, I feel like death should be an integral part of such a colony, and so should be birth. This doesn't mean that incoming colonists can't also be an additional source of new workers, but the primary focus should lie on giving birth to a new Martian population. Lastly, perhaps my biggest criticism is the fact that the type of a building is specific to what it contains. I understand why the developers made that decision, as it leads to a varied and organic look of the base. But I dislike how it limits the player in his ability to create novel pairings of interior structures. A solution would be to separate the protecting shelter from the structures inside a colony and instead rely on a system of parameters such as noise, pollution, or smell to separate interior structures. It is important to note that Planet Base isn't strictly set on Mars, but instead actually allows the player to settle on a number of different planets, and as such doesn't obey any of the realism constraints that we have imposed upon ourselves. Up to this point, I have presented you with a flood of ideas and impressions that may all individually lead to exciting and unique gameplay ideas, and are certainly all interesting by themselves. At least if you ask me, that is. However, now comes the most challenging part of putting together a list of structures, resources, tasks, professions, and systems that are both practical in the sense that I can go ahead and implement them in a somewhat reasonable amount of time, but also in the sense of being rewarding for the player. Especially when dealing with micromanagement, there's a very fine line between a system being convoluted and cumbersome, or it representing a challenge to the player for him to engage with by fine-tuning certain parameters, and the resulting feeling of satisfaction when one has achieved the absolute optimal, most efficient way of doing something, just for it to be forgotten about when the next better technology has been developed. When designing any kind of system involving user interaction, it is also essential to be clear about what sort of constraints there are. Imposing a reasonable set of restrictions can be both in the interest of development time and playability. I've already said that there most likely won't be scripting support for the game. Focusing on the gameplay side of things, I would love to have a day-night cycle. Hell, I'd even go as far as to say that not having one can be a noticeable disadvantage for some of the gameplay systems at times, but I just feel like it would require an unreasonable amount of time, especially considering the need for 2 sets of textures for each object. Another more intentional choice is to relinquish any form of combat or enemies. As I think it has become clear throughout this video, I want this game to be a somewhat realistic representation of what it'd be like to set up a colony on Mars. And yeah, I don't think aliens, zombies, or terrorists make any sense in that setting. I want this to be an in-depth city builder, rather than some form of real-time RTS mix. Although I have to admit that, when done well, those games can be a hell of a lot of fun to play as well. Lastly, as it becomes obvious from episode 3 of my indie game devlog series, I have decided to opt for a relatively simple grid-based building system with rectangular structures only. Again, this simplifies things significantly, and I think actually fits pretty well into the kind of retro style look and feel of the game. As previously discussed, it can actually have its advantages over other systems that seem to let the player play structures more freely but end up restricting the player in other less comprehensible ways.
Like many others, the latest and greatest pandemic has forced me to relocate back home without much prior warning, so I wasn't able to bring my desktop with me. Well, editing videos on a laptop is an interesting experience to say the least. Anyway, I know this has been quite a long video, but I believe it's worthwhile going in depth on this, as it outlines the direction this project is going to move in. Starting something and building the foundation is often the hardest part, and I'm more than excited to dive in and start implementing these things. Unfortunately, I have a huge amount of uni work at the moment, especially coursework that just happens to be quite time consuming. Stuff like writing a compiler or setting up remote method invocations. Exams are around the corner, so even though I try to spend as much time as possible working on the project, uni work takes priority right now. So as always, I hope you enjoyed watching and stay healthy everyone.